January 17, 1945, Okinawa Prefecture, southern Japan. The morning sun broke through the low-hanging clouds over the East China Sea, casting pale light across the rocky shoreline of a small fishing village. The air was thick with salt and the distant rumble of naval bombardment, a sound that had become as constant as breathing for those who remained. In the shadows of a collapsed wooden house, a young woman named Sato Fumiko pressed herself against the cold stone foundation, her fingers clutching a small silk pouch containing her family's ancestral register. She was 23 years old. Her husband had died 2 years earlier at Guadalcanal, a place whose name she could barely pronounce. Her daughter, only 4, had succumbed to malnutrition 3 months prior. Now, as American forces advanced across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide, Fumiko waded in the darkness, having been told by military authorities that capture meant horrors worse than death itself. The propaganda leaflets distributed by the Japanese military throughout 1944 and early 1945 painted vivid pictures of what awaited civilians who fell into American hands. Women would be violated, tortured, and displayed as trophies. Men would be castrated and forced into slave labor. Children would be torn from their mothers' arms and destroyed. These images had been seared into the collective consciousness of the Japanese population through years of conditioning, built upon the foundation of racial superiority doctrine and the Bushido code that deemed surrender the ultimate disgrace. For women especially, the shame of capture was considered worse than the honor of self-destruction. Military instructors had distributed grenades to civilian populations with explicit instructions: when the Americans come, take your children, take your elderly, and die together with honor intact. Fumiko had received such a grenade. It sat in her lap now, heavy and cold, its pin secured by a strip of cloth. She had been taught how to use it. Pull the pin, count to 3, hold it close to the body. The instructor, a severe-faced sergeant with a missing hand, had demonstrated the technique on a training dummy. "This is your final duty to the Emperor," he had said, his voice flat and mechanical. "This is how you preserve the purity of the Yamato race." Around her in that collapsed house, 3 other women huddled in similar poses of terrified resignation: Nakamura Keiko, a schoolteacher aged 31, Tanaka Yoshiko, a merchant's widow of 47, and Ono Midori, barely 19, whose husband had left for the Pacific Front just 6 weeks after their wedding. What these women expected, as they heard the crunch of American boots approaching through the rubble, was everything they had been conditioned to fear. What they experienced instead would shatter not just their immediate terror, but the entire ideological framework that had defined their understanding of the world, of race, of humanity itself. The footsteps grew closer. Through the gap in the collapsed wall, Fumiko could see shadows moving, large shapes, too large to be Japanese soldiers. "The Americans!" Her hand trembled toward the grenade pin. Beside her, Yoshiko began to whisper the Buddhist death chant, her voice barely audible. Midori closed her eyes and thought of her husband's face, wondering if she would see him in the afterlife, wondering if he would forgive her for surrendering to death rather than fighting to live. Then a voice called out in heavily accented but intelligible Japanese, "Civilians, we know you are there. We will not hurt you. Please come out slowly. We have food and medical care." The words hung in the air, impossible, contradictory to everything they knew to be true. Fumiko's fingers froze on the grenade. The voice continued, patient, almost gentle. "We have women doctors. We have medicine. Children are being cared for. Please, no one will harm you." To understand the magnitude of this moment, the psychological chasm between expectation and reality that these women faced, one must comprehend the depth of conditioning that had defined Japanese civilian consciousness throughout the war years. The Japanese government's approach to preparing its population for potential American occupation was rooted in a carefully constructed narrative that began long before Pearl Harbor and intensified with each American victory across the Pacific. This narrative drew upon multiple sources: genuine cultural differences regarding concepts of honor and surrender, exaggerated reports of Allied brutality from other theaters of war, fabricated atrocity stories created by military intelligence units, and deeply ingrained racial theories that had been taught in Japanese schools since the 1920s. From elementary school onward, Japanese children were instructed in the doctrine of Yamato Damashii, the Japanese spirit, which positioned the Japanese people as racially and spiritually superior to all other nations, particularly Western powers. Americans were characterized as materialistic barbarians, lacking in honor, discipline, and moral refinement. They were depicted as racially impure mongrels whose society was decadent, and whose military victories came only through numerical and technological superiority, never through spiritual strength or martial virtue. By the time young women like Fumiko and Midori reached adulthood, these concepts were not opinions but accepted facts, as fundamental as the existence of the sun. When American forces began their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific in 1943 and 1944, Japanese military authorities intensified their psychological preparation of civilian populations in areas likely to face invasion. Special education units were deployed to Saipan, Tinian, Okinawa, and other strategic islands to conduct mandatory training sessions for civilians. These sessions included graphic descriptions of alleged American treatment of prisoners based on fabricated intelligence reports and distorted accounts from other fronts. Women were told explicitly that American soldiers viewed Japanese females as subhuman objects to be used and discarded. The sessions often included testimonies from individuals claiming to have witnessed American atrocities, though later investigations revealed many of these testimonies were scripted by military intelligence officers. The tragedy of Saipan in June and July 1944 demonstrated the deadly effectiveness of this conditioning. As American forces secured the island, thousands of Japanese civilians, mothers with infants, elderly couples, entire families, threw themselves from the cliffs at Marpy Point rather than face capture. American soldiers and war correspondents watched in horror as women clutched their children and jumped to their deaths on the rocks below, or waded into the ocean until the waves claimed them. Some Japanese sources estimate that over 1,000 civilians died in these mass suicides. American troops attempted to prevent the deaths, using loudspeakers to broadcast assurances of safety in Japanese, but the conditioning proved too powerful. The civilians could not believe that the promises of humane treatment were genuine. They had been taught thoroughly and systematically that Americans were incapable of mercy toward Japanese people. This was the psychological landscape that Fumiko, Keiko, Yoshiko, and Midori inhabited as they huddled in that ruined house in January 1945. They were not simply afraid of immediate physical harm, they were convinced, with the certainty of religious faith, that capture meant degradation so complete that self-destruction was the only rational choice. The grenade in Fumiko's lap represented not just a weapon but an ideology, a worldview, an entire system of belief about race, honor, and the fundamental nature of the enemy. The American voice continued calling out, now closer. Then a figure appeared in the gap of the collapsed wall, not a towering brute as expected, but a young man, perhaps 25, with the same dust and exhaustion in his face that they felt in their own bones. He wore the olive-drab uniform of the U.S. Marine Corps. Behind him stood another soldier, and between them, remarkably, a Japanese woman in civilian clothes, but wearing a white armband with red lettering. An interpreter, a collaborator. Fumiko's mind immediately labeled her a traitor to the Yamato race. But the interpreter's voice, when she spoke, carried no shame or fear. "I am Suzuki Haruko from Hiroshima," she said. "I was in California when the war began. I have been helping the Americans communicate with civilians. Everything they have told you is true. They will not harm you. I have seen how they treat prisoners. They follow rules. They give medical care. They share their food. I know you cannot believe this. I could not believe it either. But it is true." The Marine sergeant, his name was Robert Morrison, from a small farming town in Iowa, though the women would not learn this until much later, slowly lowered himself to a crouch, making himself smaller, less threatening. He nodded to Haruko, who continued, "We have a medical station 300 meters from here. There are other women there from this village and the next. They are alive and unharmed. Some have been reunited with their children. There is rice, canned fish, clean water. There are women doctors. Please, come with us." Yoshiko was the first to move. The schoolteacher, trained in rational thought despite the propaganda, recognized the logical inconsistency. If the Americans truly intended brutality, Why would they negotiate? Why would they speak through an interpreter? Why not simply storm the hiding place? Her hand released the grenade she had been holding. She had not pulled the pin, and she slowly, painfully rose to her feet. Her legs shook. She had not stood fully upright in 16 hours. Through the interpreter, she asked a single question. The children. You said there are children. Are they? Are they well? Morrison nodded before Haruko could translate, understanding the universal language of maternal concern. Haruko said, yes. 3 children were found yesterday. They are being fed. They have been checked by doctors. They are alive. One by one, the women emerged from their hiding place. Fumiko came last, still clutching her silk pouch, still carrying the grenade. Morrison noticed it immediately and tensed, but Haruko intervened, speaking rapidly in Japanese. Give it to me. I will take it. You do not need it now. You will see. Fumiko's hand opened slowly, reluctantly, as if releasing the grenade meant releasing her entire understanding of duty, honor, and identity. Haruko took it carefully, handed it to Morrison, and then, in a gesture that Fumiko would remember for the rest of her life, the interpreter took Fumiko's hand and held it gently like a sister. The walk to the medical station took 20 minutes through terrain torn by bombardment. The women moved silently, watching everything with the vigilance of trapped animals. They noticed that the American soldiers did not touch them, did not press close, maintained a respectful distance. They noticed that when they stumbled on loose rubble, hands reached out to steady them, but only after a moment's hesitation, as if the soldiers themselves were uncertain about what contact was appropriate. They noticed that the Marines called out warnings about unexploded ordnance along the path, that they matched their pace to the women's slower, exhausted stride, that one soldier offered his canteen to Midori when she stumbled and coughed, though she was too frightened to accept it. The medical station was established in a partially intact school building. As they approached, the women could hear sounds that contradicted everything they expected. Not screams of torture, but voices in conversation, some in Japanese, some in English. The smell of cooking food drifted from somewhere inside. A child laughed. The sound was so unexpected that Keiko stopped walking entirely, her face registering confusion as profound as if the sky had turned green. Inside, the world inverted. 2 large classrooms had been converted into treatment areas. In one, a female U.S. Navy nurse named Lieutenant Sarah Brennan was treating an elderly man's infected leg wound, working carefully while a Japanese interpreter explained each step of the procedure. In the other, another nurse was showing a young Japanese mother how to mix powdered milk formula for her infant. The woman's own milk had dried up from malnutrition weeks earlier. Along one wall, a line of civilians waited to be examined by doctors, sitting on benches, drinking water from metal cups. Against another wall, supplies were stacked, crates marked with U.S. military labels, bags of rice, boxes of canned goods, bundles of blankets. But it was not the supplies or the medical care that struck Fumiko and the other women most forcefully. It was the tone, the atmosphere. American personnel spoke to Japanese civilians with the same inflection they used when speaking to each other, not the harsh, barking commands of the Japanese military officers the women had known, but conversational, almost casual tones. When a doctor needed a patient to remove a shirt for examination, he asked permission first. When a nurse cleaned a wound that must have hurt terribly, she apologized for causing pain. When Lieutenant Brennan finished treating the elderly man's leg, and he bowed deeply in gratitude, she bowed back, not with the shallow, dismissive gesture of a superior acknowledging an inferior, but with genuine respect. Fumiko watched all of this with her worldview cracking like ice in spring thaw. Nothing made sense. The Americans were behaving like people, like humans with the same basic courtesy and concern that Japanese civilians showed each other. This was not supposed to be possible. Americans were barbarians. Americans were racially inferior. Americans treated Japanese as subhuman. Every official pronouncement, every military briefing, every propaganda poster had confirmed these truths for years. And yet, a young corpsman named Daniel Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China to San Francisco in 1920, and who spoke conversational Mandarin that some of the older Okinawan civilians could partially understand, noticed the 4 new arrivals standing frozen in the doorway. He approached slowly, hands visible and empty, and spoke through Haruko, Welcome. You are safe here. Are any of you injured or ill? We can examine you immediately if needed, or you can rest first. Whatever you prefer. Whatever you prefer. The words were almost incomprehensible. When had anyone in authority asked what they preferred? Preferences were luxuries, irrelevant to duty, to service, to the demands of total war. Fumiko heard herself say through Haruko, There are rules for how you treat us. Chen nodded seriously. Yes, the Geneva Conventions. International laws about treatment of civilians and prisoners of war. We follow them strictly. Our commanders check regularly to ensure compliance. You will not be harmed, abused, or forced to do anything against your will. You will receive food, water, medical care, and shelter. When the war ends, you will be returned to your families. Geneva Conventions. The term meant nothing to Fumiko. The concept of international laws governing warfare existed in her understanding, but as abstract theory, not as rules that would actually be applied to her, a common Japanese woman of no particular importance. She had value only as a member of the Yamato race, as a servant of the emperor's will. The idea that foreigners, enemy foreigners, would consider her entitled to protection by international law was philosophically bewildering. Over the following hours, as the four women were examined by doctors, given food, provided with clean clothing, and assigned sleeping space in a protected corner of the building, the dissonance between expectation and reality intensified. Yoshiko, the schoolteacher, watched with particular attention to detail, trying to identify the trap, the hidden cruelty that must surely reveal itself. Soldiers and medical personnel came and went, busy with the logistics of caring for several dozen civilians who had been captured or surrendered in recent days. But the trap never sprang. The cruelty never emerged. Instead, small moments of humanity accumulated like grains of rice in a bowl. An American soldier shared his chocolate ration bar with a crying child, breaking off pieces and offering them with exaggerated funny faces until the child stopped crying and smiled tentatively. Lieutenant Brennan noticed that Midori was shivering despite the blanket she had been given, realized the young woman was feverish, and immediately administered medicine and set up an intravenous drip, sitting beside her for an hour to monitor her response. When Keiko asked through an interpreter if she could have paper and a pen to write down her memories of recent events, a teacher's instinct to document, a Marine rifleman found a notebook and several pencils, presenting them with a formal little bow that made her eyes well with tears she could not explain. But perhaps the most disorienting moment came at the evening meal. The American military had established a routine for feeding civilian detainees. Meals were served at regular times, and civilians were invited to line up to receive portions of rice, canned meat, vegetables, and biscuits. The portions were not lavish. The military's own supply lines were stretched thin, but they were consistent and adequate. More importantly, the serving process was organized without hierarchy. There was no separation of male and female, no priority given to young over old, no distinction made based on social class or occupation. Everyone waited in the same line. Everyone received the same portion. An elderly fisherman was served with the same courtesy as a merchant's wife. A child received the same attention as an adult. For Fumiko, raised in a society where hierarchy was fundamental to every social interaction, where age, gender, class, and occupation determined one's position in every transaction, this egalitarianism was deeply strange. When she reached the front of the line, a young American private, he looked barely 18, younger even than Midori, spooned rice onto her metal tray with the same efficient motion he had used for the person before her and would use for the person after her. He smiled briefly, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and said something in English. The interpreter nearby translated. He says he hopes you enjoy the meal and feel better soon. The young private had looked directly at her when he spoke, not at her body with lust, not at her face with contempt, not through her with indifference. He had looked at her the way one person looks at another person, with simple, basic recognition of shared humanity. Then he had wished her well. A foreign soldier, a conqueror, had wished her well. Fumiko carried her tray to the sitting area and lowered herself to the floor alongside other civilians. She looked down at the food, plain boiled rice, a portion of canned corned beef, some kind of beans in tomato sauce, and 2 hard biscuits. By the standards of her pre-war life, This was simple food, nothing special. By the standards of the last year of war, during which her family had subsisted on watery millet porridge and seaweed, supplemented occasionally by whatever fish her neighbors could catch, this was abundance almost obscene in its plenty. She picked up the spoon she had been given, another small mercy, real utensils rather than having to eat with fingers, and took a bite of rice. It was properly cooked, fluffy, not burned, not undercooked. Someone in the American military had taken care to prepare this rice correctly, according to the standard that would make it palatable to Japanese tastes. This seemingly trivial detail suddenly overwhelmed her. Fumiko set down her spoon and bent forward, shoulders shaking, tears flowing unchecked. Beside her, Yoshiko reached out and placed a hand on her back, understanding without words. The kindness, the basic, decent human kindness of properly cooked rice, had broken something inside that the propaganda could not rebuild. The food itself became a recurring symbol over the following days and weeks, as more Japanese civilians were captured or surrendered and were brought to American military detention facilities. Unlike the Japanese military system, which had operated under the principle that each individual served the collective good regardless of personal sacrifice, American forces allocated resources to ensure that even enemy civilians received adequate nutrition. This was not merely practical policy to prevent disease and unrest in detention camps, though those considerations existed, but reflected a deeper American cultural assumption that basic human needs were individual rights, not privileges granted by authority. Statistical records from the U.S. military government operations on Okinawa document that by April 1945, American forces were providing food for approximately 300,000 Japanese civilians, allocating roughly 1,500 calories per person per day. This exceeded the average caloric intake of Japanese civilians in the home islands during the same period, where naval blockade and strategic bombing had reduced food availability to crisis levels. The American rations provided to Okinawan civilians included rice when available, supplemented by U.S. military rations of canned goods, dried foods, and biscuits. While the food was not luxurious and variety was limited, it was consistent, adequate, and distributed with remarkable efficiency given the ongoing combat operations. More significantly, from the perspective of Japanese civilians experiencing this system, the food was given without demand for special service, without extraction of labor beyond basic camp maintenance, without sexual exploitation, and without the humiliating rituals of subordination that characterized much of Japanese military and civilian authority structures. You received food because you were a human being who needed to eat. This simple principle was so foreign to the hierarchical, duty-bound framework of Japanese wartime society that many civilians initially distrusted it, assuming hidden costs would be revealed later. Fumiko and her 3 companions remained in the medical station for 6 days, before being transferred to a larger civilian detention facility established in a partially destroyed village 10 kilometers from the front lines. During those 6 days, their understanding of the enemy transformed with each small interaction. Midori, whose fever broke after 2 days of medical treatment, began to communicate haltingly with Lieutenant Brennan through the interpreter, asking questions about America, about nursing, about what life was like for women there. Brennan spoke matter-of-factly about attending university, choosing her own profession, living independently before marriage. These concepts were not entirely foreign to Midori. Japan had its own history of working women and female professionals, but the casual, assumed equality in Brennan's descriptions was different. There was no sense of exception or special circumstance, no framework of operating within carefully prescribed boundaries. Brennan spoke of her choices and her life with the same autonomy that Midori had only heard men express. Yoshiko, the schoolteacher, engaged in longer conversations with one of the interpreters, a Japanese-American sergeant named Thomas Takahashi, whose parents had immigrated to California in 1907. Yoshiko questioned him intently about his experiences, trying to reconcile his Japanese face and family name with his American uniform and loyalty. Takahashi explained, patiently and without evident anger despite what must have been complex personal feelings, that he was American by birth, by citizenship, by choice, and by conviction. He spoke of Japanese-American soldiers fighting in Europe with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, becoming the most decorated unit in U.S. military history, even as their families were held in internment camps in America. He spoke of a country that, despite profound injustices and racism, maintained ideals of equality and rights that allowed for criticism, protest, and gradual change. "Our country is not perfect," Takahashi said, and Haruko translated with careful attention to his tone. "America has done terrible things to non-white people. My family lost our farm, our business, our dignity when we were sent to the internment camp in Arizona. I am angry about this. Many of us are angry." But he paused, searching for the right words. "But the same government that imprisoned us also allowed us to fight, to prove our loyalty, to demand our rights. The same system that contains injustice also contains mechanisms for justice. That is the difference. Your government told you Americans are barbarians. Some Americans are barbarians. Some are saints. Most are neither. They are just people. But the American system is designed with the assumption that people have rights that cannot be completely taken away, even from enemies. Your system is designed with the assumption that individuals have no rights except what the emperor grants. That is the fundamental difference." Yoshiko listened to this extended explanation with the focused attention she had once given to her teaching manuals. The logic was clear, the comparison stark. She had been taught that Japanese society was superior precisely because of its harmony, its subordination of individual desires to collective good, its spiritual refinement beyond the materialistic chaos of Western individualism. But now, sitting in a camp run by these supposedly inferior Westerners, receiving food she had not earned, medical care she could not repay, and respectful treatment despite her status as an enemy civilian, the supposed superiority of Japanese social organization seemed less certain. If the American system was so chaotic and inferior, why were its soldiers so disciplined? If Americans were so spiritually lacking, why were they showing compassion? If individual rights led to social breakdown, why was this camp, filled with displaced, traumatized civilians, functioning more humanely than the Japanese military system she had experienced? These questions had no easy answers, and Yoshiko was not prepared to abandon a lifetime of education based on a week of contradictory experience. But the questions themselves represented a crack in the ideological foundation, a space where doubt could grow. Keiko, the oldest of the four women at 47, watched everything with the weary pragmatism of someone who had survived too much to be easily surprised by anything. She had lived through the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, the global depression, the wars in China, and now this Pacific War that was clearly ending in Japan's defeat regardless of official pronouncements. She trusted her observations more than official narratives. What she observed in the medical station was simple. The Americans were organized, disciplined, and professional. They had rules and they followed them. They treated Japanese civilians better than Japanese military authorities had treated Japanese civilians in recent years. This might not fit the propaganda narrative, but it fit reality, and Keiko had long ago learned that reality was more reliable than narrative. She made a decision. On the fourth day, she approached Haruko, the interpreter, and asked if she could speak to the commander of the medical station. A Marine captain named Richard Foster was summoned. Through Haruko, Keiko said, "I was married to a merchant. I know organization. I know how to manage inventory and distribution. I see you have many supplies and many people to care for. I would like to help, not as forced labor, as someone who wants to contribute to the community here. Will you permit this?" Foster regarded her thoughtfully. According to Geneva Convention protocols, civilian internees could volunteer for work but could not be forced into labor, and any work performed should be compensated. He explained this through Haruko, then said, "If you want to help with inventory management and distribution coordination, I would be grateful for the assistance. We are overwhelmed. You would be helping both the American staff and the Japanese civilians. You would receive the same food rations as everyone else, plus a small payment in military scrip that can be used to purchase additional items when available. Does this seem acceptable? A negotiation. Terms offered rather than imposed. The acknowledgement that her help had value worthy of compensation." Keiko bowed formally and said, "It is acceptable. I will begin whenever you wish." Within 2 days, Keiko had reorganized the supply storage system, implemented a tracking method for inventory that prevented waste, and established a more efficient distribution schedule for meals that reduced waiting times. Foster was impressed enough to mention her in his daily report to higher command, noting that collaboration with qualified local civilians improves operational efficiency while demonstrating respect for local expertise. Keiko herself felt something she had not experienced in years: useful, valued, treated as a person with skills and knowledge rather than as a cipher in a national collective, a body to be moved where authority dictated. This sense of individual recognition, of being seen and valued as a person rather than as a unit of national identity, was perhaps the most profound disruption to the ideological conditioning these women had undergone. Japanese wartime ideology, built on the foundation of Kokutai national essence and Hakko Ikkyu, universal brotherhood under Japanese rule, positioned individual identity as essentially meaningless outside of one's role in the national collective. Personal desires, individual talents, private thoughts, all of these were relevant only insofar as they served the emperor and the nation. To be Japanese was to be subordinate to a collective identity so complete that individual distinction was not celebrated but suspect. American ideology, for all its contradictions and failures in practice, was built on a fundamentally different premise: that individuals possessed inherent rights and value independent of their utility to the state. The Declaration of Independence's assertion that all men are created equal with unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was taught in American schools as foundational truth, even as the reality of American society failed to honor these principles for vast numbers of people. But the gap between ideal and practice in American society created a space for reform movements, for criticism, for the demand that reality be brought closer to the ideal. There was a vocabulary of rights, of equality, of individual worth that could be deployed against injustice. Japanese civilians who encountered American military forces in 1945 were, in many cases, experiencing this vocabulary for the first time. The concept that they, as individuals, might possess rights that even enemy soldiers were obligated to respect was not merely new but philosophically alien. When Lieutenant Brennan asked Midori's permission before administering an injection, when Captain Foster negotiated terms with Keiko rather than simply issuing orders, when the young private serving food smiled at Fumiko and wished her well, these were not just acts of individual kindness, but enactments of an ideology that positioned even powerless enemy civilians as bearers of human dignity. The transfer to the larger detention facility came on the 7th day. Fumiko, Keiko, Yoshiko, and Midori were transported by truck along with 30 other civilians who had been processed through the medical station. The facility was located in what had been a middle school before the invasion, a collection of concrete buildings arranged around a central courtyard. Several thousand Japanese civilians were already housed there, living in the classrooms and hallways, sleeping on tatami mats when available or blankets when not, organized into loose family groups where possible and by gender and age, where families had been separated by the chaos of combat. As the new arrivals were processed through the entry checkpoint, names recorded, health status noted, family members identified if present, Fumiko noticed something that made her pause. An American soldier at the checkpoint was arguing, politely but firmly, with a civilian interpreter about some administrative matter. The interpreter wanted to record only the heads of families, recording dependents as numbers rather than individual names. The soldier insisted that every person must be recorded with their full name, age, and any known information about their background and family status. Everyone is an individual person, he kept repeating, in English that the interpreter translated with evident confusion. Everyone gets recorded properly. Those are the regulations. Regulations required that each person be treated as an individual. Not optional kindness, but mandatory policy. Fumiko filed this observation away with all the other contradictions she was collecting, pieces of a puzzle she was not yet ready to assemble into a complete picture. Life in the detention facility settled into routine over the following weeks. The American military government had established systems for feeding, housing, and maintaining order among the civilian population, while combat operations continued elsewhere on Okinawa. Civilians were organized into blocks for administrative purposes, with elected block leaders serving as liaisons to American authorities. Another novelty, the idea of electing representatives rather than having leaders appointed from above. Food was distributed twice daily at established times. Medical care was available at a clinic staffed by Navy medical personnel, and increasingly by Japanese civilian nurses and doctors who volunteered to help. Work details for camp maintenance, cleaning, cooking, basic repairs were organized through volunteer sign-ups rather than mandatory assignment, with small compensation provided to workers. Perhaps most remarkably, children were given priority attention. An American Army education officer, Major Patricia Dorsett, established a makeshift school in one of the larger classrooms, recruiting Japanese teachers from among the civilian detainees to provide instruction in basic literacy and mathematics. Dorsett, a former public school administrator from Massachusetts, operated on the principle that children's education should not be interrupted even by war. She supplied what materials she could acquire, paper, pencils, a few salvaged books, and encouraged the Japanese teachers to conduct classes in whatever manner they thought appropriate. The only restrictions were that military propaganda was not permitted, and that instruction should not include training that could be construed as military preparation. Yoshiko, the schoolteacher, volunteered for this program within days of arriving at the camp. Teaching was her identity, her purpose. Without it, she felt untethered. Dorsett interviewed her through an interpreter, asked about her educational background and teaching philosophy, and assigned her to work with students aged 8 to 12. On her first day, Yoshiko stood before a class of 30 children sitting on the floor of a classroom with broken windows and pockmarked walls, and asked, "What would you like to learn?" The children stared at her in confusion. What would they like to learn? Students did not choose curriculum. Teachers taught what the Ministry of Education prescribed. Individual preferences were irrelevant, but Yoshiko had been thinking about her conversations with Sergeant Takahashi, about American assumptions regarding individual rights and choices. She decided to try an experiment. "Let me ask differently," she said. "What are you curious about? What questions do you have about the world?" Slowly, tentatively, hands began to rise. A boy asked why the sky was blue. A girl wanted to know how ships floated. Another child asked if it was true that America was so large that it contained deserts and snowy mountains and vast plains all within one country. Another wondered whether American children learned different numbers than Japanese children, or if mathematics was the same everywhere. For 2 hours, Yoshiko fielded questions and provided answers when she could, admitting freely when she did not know something. Another small revolution, the idea that a teacher might acknowledge ignorance without losing authority. After the class, Major Dorsett asked how it had gone. Yoshiko said through the interpreter, "They are so curious. They have been told what to think for so long that they have forgotten how to ask questions, but they still have curiosity. It is not gone. It was just buried." Dorsett nodded. "That's what education is supposed to do. Encourage curiosity. Teach children how to think, not what to think. That's the American ideal anyway. We don't always achieve it, but it's the goal." That evening, Yoshiko lay on her tatami mat in the women's sleeping area and thought about curricula, about pedagogy, about the purpose of education. She had been trained in the Japanese system, which emphasized memorization, discipline, moral instruction aligned with national ideology, and the cultivation of attitudes appropriate to one's social role. The goal was to produce citizens who served the nation effectively. The American approach Dorsett described was different: education as cultivation of individual capacity, as preparation for citizens to think independently and participate in democratic processes. The difference was not merely methodological but philosophical, reflecting the same fundamental divide between collective subordination and individual autonomy that underlay so many of the discordances she had observed. Fumiko, meanwhile, had found different work. She had skills in sewing and fabric repair, talents she had developed out of necessity during the years of shortage when nothing could be wasted. An American quartermaster officer, learning of her abilities through the camp's labor coordinator, asked if she would be willing to repair torn uniforms and damaged cloth goods in exchange for compensation. She agreed. The work was familiar, meditative, something she could do without thinking too hard about the larger impossibilities of her situation. But it was during these long hours of stitching that she had her most revealing conversations with other women in the camp, particularly with a woman named Yamada Hisako, who was 56, and had lost her entire extended family to the bombardment. Hisako was bitter in a way that Fumiko understood. She blamed the Americans for the destruction, for the deaths, for the suffering. She recited the propaganda that Fumiko herself had believed only weeks before. Americans were cruel, ruthless, racially inferior. But even as Hisako spoke these words, she was eating American-provided rice, receiving treatment for her chronic cough from American medical personnel, and sleeping under blankets provided by American logistics. Fumiko listened without arguing, but after one particularly vehement speech about American barbarity, she said quietly, "Then why do they feed us? Why do they care for our sick? Why did the soldier give his chocolate to the child yesterday?" Hisako had no answer that satisfied her own narrative. She fell silent, then said finally, "It is a trick. They want us cooperative until the war is over. Then the cruelty will come, maybe," Fumiko said. "Or maybe we were lied to." The words hung between them, dangerous and liberating. Hisako stared at her, shocked, then angry, then thoughtful. Finally she said, "If we were lied to about this, what else was a lie?" It was the question that many Japanese civilians were beginning to ask themselves as the gap between expectation and reality became impossible to ignore. If the propaganda about American brutality was false, what about the propaganda regarding Japanese military victories? What about the assurances that Japan was winning the war? What about the claims that the emperor's divine status made Japanese defeat impossible? What about the entire structure of beliefs that had organized their lives for years? The psychological challenge of confronting these questions was immense. To accept that the fundamental narratives of one's society were false was to lose the framework that made sense of the world. It meant that sacrifices had been in vain, that suffering had been unnecessary, that the entire collective project to which individuals had subordinated their lives was built on lies. It meant that trusted authorities, military leaders, government officials, teachers, community elders, had either been deceived themselves or had knowingly deceived others. The emotional and philosophical vertigo this produced could not be overstated, yet the evidence continued to accumulate. In early March 1945, a group of Japanese civilian doctors and nurses in the detention facility were approached by American medical officers with a proposal: establish a joint medical clinic where Japanese medical professionals would treat Japanese patients under American supervision, with supplies and support provided by the U.S. military. The Japanese medical personnel would retain authority over treatment decisions within their domain, consulting with American doctors when specialized expertise was needed. This was not forced collaboration, but voluntary professional cooperation, organized with explicit respect for Japanese medical competence and cultural understanding of patients. Dr. Kawasaki Hiroto, a physician who had practiced in Naha before the invasion, was skeptical. He participated in the initial meetings with American medical officers expecting condescension, expecting to be treated as a subordinate technician rather than a fellow professional. Instead, he found himself in technical discussions about treatment protocols, about supply priorities, about public health measures to prevent epidemic disease in the crowded conditions of the camp. The American doctors, 2 captains and a major, all experienced physicians, addressed him as a colleague. They asked for his input. They deferred to his judgment on matters related to Japanese cultural practices that affected medical care. When Dr. Kawasaki suggested a different approach to managing tuberculosis cases, based on his understanding of patient compliance in Japanese cultural context, the American major considered the proposal seriously and agreed to implement it. After the meeting, Dr. Kawasaki sat in stunned silence for several minutes. One of the Japanese nurses, a woman named Ogawa Sachiko, who had been imprisoned by the Japanese military police 2 years earlier for the crime of her brother being suspected of communist sympathies, asked him what was wrong. He said, "They treated me as an equal, as a doctor speaking to other doctors. They did not assume American medical knowledge was superior. They listened." Ogawa smiled without humor. "Yes, that is what they do. They assume people are people. It is very disorienting." The joint clinic opened a week later and quickly became essential to camp operations. Japanese patients were more comfortable with Japanese medical personnel who understood their language and cultural expectations, while American supplies and specialized expertise provided resources that Japanese doctors alone could not access. The collaboration worked because it was structured as genuine partnership rather than as occupation control. This model, American material support combined with respect for Japanese expertise and autonomy, represented a very different approach to occupation than what Japanese military forces had implemented in occupied territories in China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Japanese soldiers and civilians who had participated in or witnessed Japanese occupation in these areas had seen systematic brutality, forced labor, sexual slavery, mass executions, medical experimentation on prisoners, exploitation of local resources without regard for local populations, and the systematic subordination of conquered peoples to Japanese authority. This was not incidental cruelty but policy, reflecting an ideology that positioned Japanese as racially superior and other Asians as lesser peoples to be brought under Japanese control for their own benefit. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere rhetoric claimed to be liberating Asia from Western colonialism, but the reality was a Japanese colonial system that often exceeded Western colonialism in its harshness. Japanese civilians had not been exposed to the full truth of Japanese military conduct in occupied territories. Military censorship controlled information strictly, but most had absorbed the underlying attitude: conquered peoples should serve their conquerors, might made right, and military victory justified any action. This was the template through which many Japanese civilians expected to experience American occupation. They had been on the winning side of this dynamic in the early war years, when Japanese forces conquered vast territories. Now they were on the losing side. The reversal of positions meant they expected to experience what Japanese forces had inflicted on others. Instead, they experienced Geneva Conventions, international law, rules of war, the concept that even in victory, there were limits to what the powerful could do to the powerless. As spring progressed and combat operations on Okinawa moved toward their devastating conclusion, the detention facility's population swelled. By late April 1945, over 8,000 Japanese civilians were housed there, with more arriving daily as American forces advanced. The American military government worked frantically to expand capacity, to maintain order, to prevent the outbreak of disease in the crowded conditions. It was a massive logistical undertaking, and it was not without problems. Supplies sometimes ran short. Miscommunications occurred. Individual American soldiers sometimes behaved badly. Theft of personal property was occasionally reported, as was inappropriate behavior toward women, though such incidents were investigated and punished when documented. But the system itself continued to function according to principles of humane treatment. When a measles outbreak threatened the children's section of the camp in late April, American medical personnel implemented an immediate quarantine and vaccination program, prioritizing the health of enemy civilian children with the same urgency they would give to American children. When the camp food supplies ran critically low during a particularly intense period of fighting that disrupted supply lines, American personnel reduced their own rations to maintain civilian feeding schedules. When a group of elderly civilians presented a petition requesting space to conduct Buddhist memorial services for family members who had died, the camp commandant approved the request and allocated a room for this purpose, even assigning a detail to clean and prepare the space appropriately. None of this was required by strict military necessity. Much of it came from policy decisions made at higher command levels, reflecting strategic calculation that humane treatment of civilians would ease occupation and reconstruction after Japanese surrender. But in its implementation on the ground, the policies reflected individual choices by American personnel to treat enemy civilians with dignity. These individuals, soldiers, nurses, doctors, administrators, were not saints. They were ordinary Americans with the full range of prejudices, character flaws, and moral limitations common to any group of humans. But they were operating within a system that articulated standards for humane treatment, and that enforced those standards with sufficient consistency to make them real rather than merely rhetorical. For Fumiko, the moment of complete ideological transformation came in late May. She had been in American custody for 4 months. The initial terror had long since faded, replaced by adaptation to camp routine. She worked on sewing repairs, attended occasional classes that Yoshiko organized on literature and history, maintained her small sleeping space, and waited for the war to end so she could learn if any of her extended family had survived. She had not forgotten her dead husband and daughter, but the sharp edge of grief had dulled to persistent ache. She was alive, she was fed, she was safe. These basic facts, taken together, contradicted everything she had been taught to expect. One afternoon, while working on a pile of torn shirts in the sewing area, she overheard a conversation between two American soldiers who had brought items for repair. They were speaking English, unaware that Yamada Hisako, who had worked in Manchuria before the war and knew some English, was sitting nearby and could understand much of what they said. One soldier was complaining about the food, about the heat, about missing his girlfriend back in Texas. The other was agreeing sympathetically, but then said something that made Hisako's breath catch. "At least we get real food though. Did you hear the civilian ration got cut again last week? I felt bad yesterday seeing those kids with smaller portions. Makes me want to share mine." The first soldier said, "Yeah, but we're not supposed to. Medical officer said we need to maintain our nutrition for combat effectiveness. Can't help anyone if we collapse." I know. It doesn't make me feel better about it though. These are just regular people. Families, not soldiers, not the enemy. Just people who got caught in the war. Hisako translated the conversation in whispers for Fumiko and the other women in the sewing area. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Fumiko said, "He sees us as people, not as Japanese, not as the enemy. As people, yes," Hisako said. "That is what they do. They make distinctions. Soldier versus civilian, combatant versus non-combatant, people versus enemy. We did not make such distinctions. For us, all Americans were the enemy, but they divide the world differently." Fumiko thought about this through the rest of the day and into the night. The ability to make moral distinctions, to see that the enemy nation contained people who were not themselves enemies, to recognize that even in total war there were categories of humans who should be protected. Was this a weakness or a strength? Japanese military ideology had taught that it was weakness, a sentimental failure to fully commit to national survival. Total war required total mobilization, total dedication, total sacrifice. There was no space for nuance, for categories, for distinctions that might weaken resolve. But here, in this camp, the American capacity for making distinctions had produced a system in which she, enemy civilian, was alive and safe. The Japanese refusal to make such distinctions had produced seipan, where women threw their children from cliffs rather than trust the enemy's humanity. Which approach was actually stronger? Which produced better outcomes? Which was more civilized? These questions had answers that Fumiko was no longer afraid to acknowledge. The symbolic object that came to represent this transformation, for Fumiko and many others, was simple: canned food. The American military rations included various canned goods, meat, beans, fruit, vegetables, packaged in tin cans with printed labels showing pictures of the contents. These cans were everywhere in the camp, used and reused for various purposes after the food was consumed. But it was the labels that fascinated many Japanese civilians, particularly those who could read some English or who had interpreters explain the text. The labels contained detailed information: ingredients, nutritional content, preparation instructions, the name and location of the manufacturer, a date stamp indicating when the food was canned. This transparency was remarkable. The labels told you exactly what you were eating, who made it, and when. There were no mysteries, no secrets. The American military distributed food with such abundance that they could afford to print detailed information on every container. More than that, they seemed to assume that people had the right to know what they were consuming. Fumiko kept an empty can that had contained peaches in syrup. She had eaten those peaches slowly, savoring each piece, and when the can was empty she washed it carefully and kept it among her few possessions. On the label was a picture of golden peach halves in clear syrup, looking exactly like what had been inside. The text promised Del Monte yellow cling peaches in heavy syrup, and listed contents, weight, and the location of the cannery in California. At the bottom of the label was a sentence in small print, distributed by the United States Armed Forces, for official use only, not for commercial resale. She stared at that can for hours over the weeks, studying it like a religious text. This object represented a system of abundance so vast that food could be preserved in individual containers, labeled with precision, transported across an ocean, and distributed to enemy civilians. It represented an industrial capacity so overwhelming that Japan's military resistance had been futile from the beginning. It represented a culture that valued transparency, that printed instructions and information freely, that assumed people should know what they were consuming. It represented everything that contradicted the propaganda about American barbarism and weakness. Other women in the camp had similar talismans. Yoshiko kept a pencil she had been given for her teaching, a yellow hexagonal pencil with pink eraser stamped with U.S. government along its side, made with such surplus that it could be given freely to an enemy civilian schoolteacher for the purpose of educating enemy children. Keiko kept a medical form from the clinic, marveling at the standardization, the systematic organization of information, the assumption that every individual patient deserved documentation and tracked care. Midori kept a small bar of soap that Lieutenant Brennan had given her, actual soap made specifically for washing hands, not the harsh lye mixture they had been using for years in Japan. Each object was ordinary, mundane. Each object represented a worldview. The war in Europe ended in early May 1945. News reached Okinawa slowly, filtered through American military announcements translated into Japanese and posted on bulletin boards in the camp. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The European theater was over. This meant that the full weight of American and Allied military power would now focus exclusively on Japan. For Japanese civilians who retained hope for some kind of negotiated peace or miraculous reversal, this news was crushing. For those like Fumiko who had already accepted inevitable defeat, it was merely confirmation. The fighting on Okinawa itself continued through June, brutal and devastating. Japanese military forces had established defensive positions throughout the southern portion of the island, fighting with desperate intensity. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers died. Thousands of American soldiers died. Tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians died, caught between the armies, killed by bombardment, executed by Japanese soldiers who suspected them of cooperation, or dead by suicide under military pressure. The detention facility where Fumiko and the others lived was relatively insulated from the worst of this, but the sounds of artillery were constant, and the arrival of new refugees brought horror stories of what was happening in the combat zones. In late June, organized Japanese military resistance on Okinawa collapsed. By early July, the island was secured. The focus of American military planning shifted to the invasion of the Japanese home islands, scheduled for November. But for the civilians in detention, the end of fighting on Okinawa meant a transition from temporary camp to longer-term occupation administration. American military government officials began planning for eventual repatriation of civilians, for reconstruction of damaged areas, for the establishment of more permanent administrative systems. It was during this transition period that Fumiko experienced what would be her final and most profound confrontation with the gap between expectation and reality. A group of American military government officers, working with Japanese civilian leaders elected from among the camp population, organized a town meeting to discuss future arrangements. This meeting was to be democratic. Anyone could attend, anyone could speak. Questions were encouraged, and the discussion would inform policy decisions. The concept of a town meeting where ordinary civilians could question and influence authority was so foreign that many camp residents simply did not understand what was being proposed. Keiko, who had become a respected figure in camp administration through her work with supplies, explained it repeatedly. They want to hear our opinions. They want us to tell them what we need and what concerns we have. They will make decisions based partly on what we say. Why would they do that? Someone asked. We are their prisoners. They can do whatever they want with us. Yes, Keiko said. They can, but they choose not to. They choose to ask us. This is their custom. This is their way of governing. The meeting took place in the largest classroom available, packed with several hundred people and many more listening from outside. An American lieutenant colonel named Harrison, the senior military government officer for the district, spoke through interpreters for 20 minutes, explaining the current situation, the plans for eventual repatriation, the need to organize work details for reconstruction, the systems being established for education and medical care. Then he said, "Now I want to hear from you. What questions do you have? What problems are you experiencing? What do you need?" Silence. No one moved. The idea of speaking to such a high-ranking officer, of questioning his decisions, of presenting demands, it was inconceivable. The Japanese military system did not work this way. Subordinates obeyed. Period. Harrison waited patiently. After several long minutes, he said, "Let me try differently. Show of hands, who here has not received adequate food in the past week?" A few hands rose tentatively. "Okay, thank you. We will investigate the distribution system and fix any problems. Who has family members missing and needs help locating them?" More hands. "We will expand the family reunification program. Who needs materials for the school program?" Yoshiko raised her hand and was asked to speak. She stood trembling and said through the interpreter, "We need more paper, more writing instruments, basic textbooks if possible." Harrison made notes and nodded. "We will prioritize educational supplies in the next supply delivery." What else? Gradually, over the next hour, people began to speak. Someone asked about medical care for chronic conditions. Someone asked about the possibility of retrieving personal property from destroyed homes. Someone asked whether religious practices would be permitted. Someone asked when they might be able to return to their villages. Harrison answered each question seriously, sometimes saying, "I don't know, but I will find out," sometimes explaining limitations due to ongoing military operations, sometimes immediately agreeing to implement suggested solutions. Fumiko watched this process with wonder. This was governance. This was how these Americans understood authority, not as absolute power to be obeyed without question, but as responsibility to serve populations, even enemy populations, with some level of accountability and responsiveness. It was not pure democracy. The military government had final authority and could override any civilian input, but it was a form of governance that acknowledged that even powerless people had legitimate interests that deserved consideration. After the meeting, as people dispersed, Fumiko found herself walking alongside an elderly man named Nakamura Takeshi, who had been a Shinto priest before the war. He was weeping silently. She asked if he was unwell. He shook his head and said, "I have lived 73 years. I served in the war with Russia in 1905. I have been a loyal subject of the emperor all my life, and now I find that the enemy treats me with more humanity than my own government did. How can this be? How can the barbarians be more civilized than we are?" Fumiko had no answer because the question was rhetorical. Nakamura knew the answer. They all knew the answer now. The civilization they had been taught to revere, the culture they had been told was superior to all others, the national essence they had been raised to serve, all of it had been revealed as something smaller and more fragile than they had believed. Not worthless, not without value, but not superior, not exceptional, not the center of the universe. The atomic bombs fell in August. Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th. News reached the camp in fragments, barely believable. An entire city destroyed by a single bomb. Tens of thousands dead instantly. Fires that consumed everything. Radiation sickness that killed survivors weeks later. The scale of destruction was so immense that it seemed like propaganda, like the exaggerations that had characterized all war reporting. But as more information arrived, as survivors began to appear in newsreels that American military government officials showed to camp populations, the truth became undeniable. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice, heard by the public for the first time in his reign, announced over radio that Japan had accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration and would surrender unconditionally. The war was over. In the detention camp, the reaction was complex. Relief that the killing had stopped. Grief for all that had been lost. Fear about what occupation would bring. Confusion about what surrender meant for personal identity and national future. But alongside these emotions was something else, something that Fumiko felt clearly. The recognition that surrender meant survival. Continuing the war would have meant destruction. American occupation, for all its uncertainties, had already proven more humane than they had been led to expect. Perhaps impossibly, they would be allowed to live. Over the following weeks and months, as the American occupation of Japan began in earnest, the patterns established in camps like the one on Okinawa replicated across the Japanese home islands. American forces occupied Japan with massive military presence, but with policies aimed at reconstruction rather than punishment, at transformation rather than destruction. War crimes trials would prosecute specific individuals for specific crimes, but the general population would be fed, housed, and governed under occupation policies that prioritized stability and gradual democratization. The new Japanese constitution, drafted under American supervision and adopted in 1947, contained language that would have seemed impossible to Fumiko and her companions in 1945. All of the people are equal under the law, and there shall be no discrimination in political, economic, or social relations because of race, creed, sex, social status, or family origin. Article 14. Constitutional guarantee of equality, including gender equality. Women were given the right to vote for the first time in Japanese history. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, all constitutionally protected. The emperor became a symbolic figurehead with no political power. Sovereignty resided with the people, not with a divine monarch. These changes were imposed by occupation authority, not chosen by the Japanese people through democratic process. The new constitution was not purely voluntary, but it created a framework that, over decades, became internalized, became valued, became the foundation for a democratic society that most Japanese people came to cherish and defend. The transformation from imperial militarism to constitutional democracy was a process, not an instant conversion, but it began with moments like Fumiko clutching a grenade in a collapsed house, hearing an American voice promise safety, and choosing to believe it might be true. Fumiko herself survived the war and lived until 1987. She never remarried. She worked for many years as a seamstress in Naha, which was rebuilt slowly from its ruins. She kept that empty peach can on a shelf in her small apartment for the rest of her life, explaining to visitors that it represented the day she learned that people could be better than their governments, that enemies could become protectors, that humanity could transcend ideology. She told her story to students, to journalists, to historians who came to record the memories of those who had experienced the war. She always ended the same way. I expected to die. I wanted to die. I believed that dying was the only honorable choice, but they taught me that living could be honorable too, that I had value just as a person, not just as a Japanese person or a woman or a subject of the emperor, just as a human being. That was their gift to me. That was what democracy meant. Yoshiko continued teaching for 3 decades after the war, becoming a principal of an elementary school in the 1960s. She always remembered her conversation with Sergeant Takahashi about the difference between systems designed to grant rights versus systems designed to assign duties. She taught her students to ask questions, to think critically, to recognize that authority could be questioned, and that questioning was not disloyalty but citizenship. She died in 1992, having seen Japan transform from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy, having watched students she taught grow up in a society that, for all its flaws, gave them freedoms she had never imagined in her youth. Keiko worked in municipal administration during the occupation and the post-occupation period, bringing her organizational skills to the work of reconstruction. She was part of the first generation of Japanese women to vote in national elections in 1946, an experience she described as surreal. I walked to the polling station, I marked my ballot in privacy, I placed it in the box. No one told me how to vote. No one checked my choice. It was mine alone. I was 49 years old, and it was the first time I had been trusted to make a political decision. Midori married again in 1948 to a schoolteacher she met during the occupation period. They had 4 children. She told them stories of the war, of the fear and the hunger, but also of Lieutenant Brennan, the American nurse who had treated her with such care, who had spoken to her as an equal, who had shown her that women could be educated professionals with authority and autonomy. Her oldest daughter became a doctor. Her youngest became a translator. Both credited their mother's stories about Americans who treated her with respect as inspiration for their careers. The transformation these women experienced was replicated, in various forms, by millions of Japanese people who encountered American occupation forces in the aftermath of surrender. The encounter contradicted expectations so completely that it forced a re-evaluation of fundamental assumptions about race, about civilization, about power, about what it meant to be human. This was not instant enlightenment. Prejudices and hierarchies persisted, and American occupation had its own brutalities and injustices. But the gap between the promised horrors and the actual experience was wide enough to create space for new understanding. The symbolic power of food, those canned goods, those rations that properly cooked rice, represented American abundance in a way that no amount of propaganda could have achieved. It was material proof that the American system, for all its flaws, generated wealth on a scale that Japanese militarism could never match. It was daily evidence that American capacity for organization and logistics was overwhelming. It was repeated demonstration that Americans were willing to share that abundance even with enemies, that the ideology of universal human rights had practical consequences even in the context of total war. But more than abundance, the symbol represented a different relationship between individual and state. In the Japanese system, food was allocated by authority according to hierarchy and need as defined by the state. Individuals ate what they were given, when they were given it, in amounts determined by their role in the collective. In the American system, at least as it was implemented in occupation camps and later in occupation policy, food was treated as a right. People ate because they were human and humans need food. The distribution was organized and systematic, but the underlying principle was entitlement based on humanity, not on service or status. This principle extended across multiple domains: medical care, legal protection, educational opportunity, political participation, formed the foundation of the democratic transformation that occurred in Japan after 1945. The women who survived internment in camps like the one on Okinawa became living bridges between the old ideology and the new reality. They told their stories. They raised children with different assumptions. They participated in building a new kind of society, one that preserved Japanese cultural identity while incorporating principles of individual rights and democratic governance that had been unimaginable a decade earlier. The epilogue to their experience is written in the Japan that exists today: a prosperous democracy, a society that honors tradition while embracing change, a nation that transformed from militaristic empire to peaceful economic power, a culture that maintains its distinct identity while engaging fully with the global community. That transformation was not predetermined. It was not inevitable. It resulted from specific choices made by specific people in specific circumstances. Among those choices was the American decision to treat enemy civilians according to Geneva Convention standards, to implement policies of humane occupation, to pursue reconstruction rather than revenge. These were strategic choices, motivated by pragmatic calculation about how to transform an enemy into a stable ally. But they were also moral choices, enacted by individual soldiers and administrators who had been raised in a culture that, despite profound failures to live up to its ideals at home, had articulated a vision of universal human rights that could be extended even to former enemies. And among those choices was the decision by women like Fumiko, Keiko, Yoshiko, and Midori to release the grenades they had been given, to emerge from hiding, to trust the impossible promises of safety, to remain alive when death had seemed like the only honorable choice. They chose to live. In choosing to live, they chose to witness. In choosing to witness, they chose to testify. In choosing to testify, they helped build a different future. The peachcan remained on Fumiko's shelf until her death, a relic of transformation, a memorial to the moment when ideology met reality and reality won. Beside it, she kept a small photograph, herself at age 70, voting in a national election, smiling at the camera with an expression that mixed pride and disbelief and gratitude. Beneath the photograph, in her careful handwriting, she had written a single sentence: "I am a person. This is enough." In the end, perhaps that was the most revolutionary idea of all. Not American abundance, not military might, not technological superiority, but the simple insistence that every individual possessed inherent worth simply by virtue of being human, that a young woman hiding in rubble with a grenade in her hand deserved to be treated with dignity, that her life had value independent of national ideology or racial identity or service to collective goals, that she was a person and this was enough. The Americans who implemented occupation policy were not saviors bestowing civilization on primitives. They were people operating within a system that, imperfectly and inconsistently, had articulated principles of human rights and democratic governance. The Japanese civilians who experienced that system were not passive recipients of foreign ideology. They were people making difficult choices in impossible circumstances, choosing survival over death, choosing to rebuild rather than surrender to despair, choosing to create something new from the ruins of everything they had known. Together, occupier and occupied, victor and vanquished, they built a peace that lasted. Not a perfect peace, not a peace without tensions and resentments and unresolved griefs, but a peace that endured, that allowed for healing, that created space for prosperity and freedom and gradual reconciliation. That peace was built on many foundations: strategic calculation, economic aid, constitutional reform, educational transformation, cultural exchange. But it began with simpler things: a soldier offering safety to a terrified woman, a nurse treating an enemy patient with care, a can of peaches shared with someone who expected only cruelty. These small acts of humanity, multiplied across thousands of encounters, accumulated into something larger, a demonstration that the ideology of universal human rights could be more than rhetoric, that even in the context of total war there could be limits to violence, that enemies could recognize each other's humanity without abandoning their own identities. The women who experienced this recognition carried it forward into the decades of peace that followed, into the society they helped rebuild, into the stories they told their children and grandchildren. And in those stories always there was a moment of transformation, a moment when expectation met reality and everything changed, a moment when fear met kindness and could not remain intact, a moment when ideology met evidence and had to yield, a moment when a woman clutching a grenade heard a voice promising safety and chose, impossibly, to believe. That moment, replicated millions of times in millions of variations, was the moment when peace became possible. Not inevitable, not guaranteed, but possible. And sometimes, in the wreckage of total war, possibility is enough.